Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. I think if it's okay with you, we'll get underway because we've actually got quite a lot to get through. I appreciate that there might be a few people arriving late. That's absolutely fine. But I'd like to get underway if that's okay and welcome you to this morning's presentation. It's all about equality, diversity, and inclusion. It's going to last about 3 hours, 3 and a bit hours, which I'm sure you're going to think to yourself, goodness me, that sounds like an awful long time. I promise you it isn't. It will fly by. And it's interesting to welcome you this morning because I've been doing this quite a long time now. And when I first started training, the person who trained me said invariably you're going to get 3 groups of people that's going to attend your lectures. The first group of people are what I describe as the willing participants. So the email goes round, equality, diversity, inclusion. They think to themselves, do you know what, that sounds really interesting. I'll look forward to that. Interesting to find out a bit more about that. The second group are what I describe as the holiday makers. The email comes round and they think to themselves, well, okay, I don't know much about it, but you know what, hey, it's a few hours away from my desk, it's a little bit of a break, holiday makers, no problem at all. The third group of people are what he described as the prisoners. They don't even look at the email. And then when they do ask to look at it, they think to themselves, oh, I'll give that a miss. What? Actually, no, I have to come and do it? Really? I have to? But, you know, I've got all this other work to do. You know, do I really have to come and do it? Yes, you do. So I hope there are not too many prisoners here this morning. Hopefully, if you are a prisoner, you're at least kind of just open your mind a little bit, just relax and try and take it in and engage in the process because it is interesting and it's important. And, you know, I think you can see I've been around the block a few times. I don't think I've ever lived through a period in my life where there's so much tension in the world, where there is so much pushback, where the world is so polarized. So I think these kind of conversations around equality, around appreciating diversity, around trying to foster a sense of belonging so that we all can just get along a little bit better together, surely that's a conversation worth having. So welcome today. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, today's lecture is an introduction. It's not a deep dive, although we do kind of pack quite a lot in. We try and give you a bit of an overview of equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I think that ought to change a little bit. That ought to sort of say belonging as well, because as I say, ultimately, if you are different, you want a voice, you want to be appreciated, you want to be valued as a human being, you want to feel that your voice is listened to. The lecture this morning is under the umbrella of an organisation called the Diversity Trust. It's an organisation I've been working for the last 2.5 years. It's a community interest company. We kind of specialise in this kind of work. We're not for profit. We've been going a long time now. This year it's our 10th anniversary. So in August we're all going off to Bristol and having a big party. So we're equalities led. What do they mean by that? There are generalists within the organisation like myself who have a degree of academic qualification, have some degree of lived experience, but generally deliver introductory programmes, overviews. Sometimes when people do the training, they find that they want to learn more, perhaps about race, or about LGBTQ issues, or about transgender issues. Those workshops are always delivered by people who have a genuine lived experience. We work in partnership with other organisations. Often we work for charities, or in the case of today, we deliver the training independently. And we're researched and evidence-based. We are passionate about what we do, so we try and make sure that everything we talk about is substantiated. It has to be said, though, although I do try and keep facts and opinions separate, I do give an awful lot of my own opinions where this work is concerned. Please don't feel you have to agree with me. I'm not standing here before you this morning saying I am the expert, this is the truth. I'm just giving you my impression, and I'd be really interested to hear your point of view as well. If you get a little bit of time in your busy schedule, at some point I would urge you to have a little look at the Diversity Trust. There is an awful lot of open source free material on that website. There are links to podcasts, links to articles, and that is just a very small snapshot of many of the training programs that we deliver. The training today is delivered by me. Welcome, my name's Steve Morley. I am a trainer and a consultant with the Diversity Trust. And I have been teaching a long time. It seems like a very long time. I was saying to Stuart, technically I retired many years ago, but you know what it's like with people who retire, they can't stop working. So I saw some friends of mine over Christmas that I hadn't seen for about 3 years. The first thing they said to me is, "Are you still teaching? I thought you'd retired," which I thought was a bit of a cheek, really. But, you know, I gave them my best Zen master saying, which is, if you're still breathing, then your work is not finished. So, yes, I am still teaching. When I'm not teaching, I like to be an advocate. I try to be an ally. I work with marginalised groups. I work with oppressed minority groups. I work in mental health. I work in disability. I work with homeless organisations. And I do a lot of work with young people, particularly young people who are in danger of being excluded. I do a lot of work in pupil referral units, for example. But you can pretty much sum me up by that paragraph at the end of the slide. A person who is committed to celebrating difference, to respecting difference, and not just tolerating difference. And this is the thing, you know, it's one thing if difference is tolerated, but, you know, we live in a world where it's not tolerated, where things don't just irritate people anymore, they enrage people They enrage people. People rail against LGBT issues. They rage against transgender issues. You know, they rage against racial issues. It triggers people, and we're going to be talking about why that should be as we go through the presentation. What else do I bring? Well, 69 years of lived experience, I suppose. That picture on your screen is actually Rathbone Market in Canning Town, East London. Don't know if any of you know that part of London at all. It's very close to the Royal Docks. You've got the two main arteries going into London. You've got Commercial Road and East India Dock Road. Very, very rich multicultural community. It was in the 60s, and it's even more so now. I think the difference between now and then was in the 60s, whilst it was incredibly diverse, it was also very polarised. It was very much us and them. And it was at that market, when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I suppose, that I first became aware of racism. Of course, you know, you can imagine at 7 years old, you have no idea that it's racism. But at the entrance to the old market used to sit a Sikh gentleman. And he used to sit on the floor, cross-legged, at the entrance to the old market with a tray on his lap, and he used to sell matches and bootlaces to people going in and out of the market. I thought he was a fascinating character. And had I been older, I would have certainly gone and spoken to him. But, you know, as a 7 or 8-year-old, you don't have a voice. And I used to get taken to the market by my grandparents. And to my grandparents and people of their generation, he very much represented other. And they used to call him the Moo Man. And they used to say to me, now, when we get into the market, you stay close to me. Because if you get lost, the Moo Man will get you. And parents used to threaten their children with him. You know, behave yourself, I'll get the Moo Man onto you, the Moo Man will get you. Parents used to threaten their children with him. Really interesting. I mean, that was like over 60 years ago. Interesting to see how society has changed, because in some ways it's changed radically, but in other ways it hasn't changed very much at all. And we're going to be exploring those issues over the next few hours. This is training. Of course it is. For me, it's a conversation. For me, it's an interaction, but it is training. It has learning outcomes. It's designed to be an overview, as I suggested earlier. It's an introduction, if you will, but we will be packing quite a lot in. We will be talking about legislation, of course we will. We'll talk a little bit about the Equality Act and about different forms of discrimination and about the timeline of anti-discrimination legislation in the UK. But hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about language, why language matters, how it frames the narrative, how people have a great deal of difficulty with language. I promise you, if I had £1 for every time I delivered one of these and somebody said to me, you know what, sometimes I just feel like I'm treading on eggshells. I don't know what to say. Is this the right thing to say? Is that the right thing to say? I'm very wary about offending anybody and offending people. So we'll talk a little bit about language and how we can better navigate that. At the end of the day, I want you to be asking yourself questions. I know that when people do book up for training, often they're looking for answers. But it might well be after this presentation you have more questions than answers. Frankly, I make no apology for that. If you're asking yourself questions after the training that you weren't asking before, I don't think that's a bad thing. But we will try and embed the learning. You will get all the slides. You'll also get an awful lot of follow-up material. So everything that we talk about today, of course, you're more than welcome to take notes, of course you are. But everything we talk about today is supported with follow-up material. Safety is important. This presentation is not too contentious. It is a game of two halves, though. The first half is pretty relaxed. The second half, perhaps not so much, because in the second half, we will be talking about discrimination. We will be talking about prejudice. We'll be talking about institutional racism. We'll be talking about unconscious bias and the assumptions that we make. We'll be talking about microaggressions, which is a very contentious subject. And we'll be talking about language as well. So in that second half, that might get a little bit more bumpy. It's important that you take care of yourself. It's difficult in person because if somebody has to get up and leave, then it's very obvious that they've got up and left. It's unlike an online presentation where you can just turn your camera off and nobody's any the wiser. But I would not want anybody to be in distress. So if you find any of it distressing and you need to just take 5 minutes, then take 5 minutes. But please, please come back because I think the conversation's worth having. And also you're going to be doing some breakout sessions where you're going to be talking amongst yourselves. Please respect people's confidentiality. Sometimes these things trigger people and people then want to share opinions. It's not very nice, is it, if you go back to the office and you say, oh, you know, you never guessed what Steve said in the training we did the other day. No, please respect people's confidentiality. Create a safe space and a brave space. So why? Why is it worthwhile having this conversation in the first place? I think it's beneficial for everyone. It really is. I think it's a really worthwhile thing. Surely at any kind of level, we could appreciate that if we can all just get on better together, isn't that better? Isn't that better if we can just rub along with people without conflict, without arguing, without being, aggressive with one another? If we can just get on better together, surely that's a nicer way to live than to be at each other's throats all the time. It's beneficial in any kind of organisation. Diversity is of a benefit to whether you're a small company, whether you're an organisation that's large, whether you're an educational institution or in society in general. It has a benefit, which I hope to demonstrate. It fosters learning. It changes people's attitude. People affect what's called a paradigm shift, where they start to question, well, why? Well, why did that trigger me? Why did I get upset about that? Why did I make that assumption about this person and I didn't make that assumption about this other person? Why? Where is that coming from? If you start to question that, you start to change. And then you influence people who know you and younger people, and then we get more involved, more compassionate, more empathic leaders in our society. And we live in a society and in a country that's reasonably civilized in the United Kingdom. So we have laws in place, we have legislation which is designed to protect us against the worst forms of discrimination. So it's the law. If we talk about what we mean, because we just bandy the words around, don't we? Equality, diversity, inclusion, you know, do people really know what they mean? Often when we do all-day courses, we invite people to suggest what equality might mean for them, what diversity might mean, what inclusion might mean. And we kind of do a little poll and we get some, you know, feedback from the session. It's interesting, some of the things that come back. One of the things that's often talked about is rights, human rights, people's rights to be different, and the fact that you should have the right to be different. If you are different from me, you should have the right to be different from me, and you shouldn't face persecution or prejudice simply because you are different from me, which means that you have to be valued as an individual. It's about having choices and having dignity. I mean, I look at myself, I look at where I am in the world, I'm blessed, I am privileged, I have many choices, and I have a certain amount of dignity. But I also am fully aware that for many, many oppressed and marginalised people in the world, they have very few choices, and often dignity is denied to them. It's about having the right to your own beliefs and your own values, which doesn't mean that I have to abandon mine. It doesn't mean I have to give up my faith or my lack of faith or my way of looking at the world. It simply means that I have to give you space to have your own view and your own beliefs. And I certainly don't have to agree with you, but I do have to give you the respect to have your own rights, your own beliefs, your own values. And I think this is where an awful lot of the pushback comes today in the society that we live. Because I think certain people, they sort of see equality as like a giant pie. Do you know? It's like a giant pie, and if I give you pie, there's somehow going to be less pie for me. Do you know? I mean, I sympathise with you, I really do. I think it's a terrible way that you're being treated, and I would love you to have more pie. But of course, there's not going to be enough to go around, is there? And I need to hold on to my bit of pie. Equality doesn't work like that. If you will think of equality as a pie, think of it as an infinite pie. There's plenty of pie to go round. Me giving you pie doesn't mean there's any less pie for me. Me giving you the right to your beliefs and your values don't take away mine. Diversity doesn't diminish us. It empowers us. It doesn't make us less than, it makes us more than. If we think of diversity, we're talking about array, aren't we? We're talking about mixture. We are talking about difference, but it's about understanding and respecting that difference. I think as human beings, we kind of understand the value of diversity, because we say to young people, don't we? We say to young people, look, before you settle down, you need to leave your little town, leave your little village, and take a year out, travel the world, maybe learn a different language, get out and see how other people look at the world, find out how different cultures view the world. Do you know what? When you come back, you'll be so much more well-rounded. You'll be a much better human being for having had the experience. We kind of get that. And yet somehow when diversity turns up on our doorstep, we feel that we need to push it away, because somehow if we don't, all our way of life, all our values will be just stripped away. We'll just be eroded and be replaced by all this strange otherness. No, diversity doesn't diminish us, it enriches us. It doesn't make us less than, it makes us more than. This is one of my favourite slides in the whole slide deck. I don't know if any of you are into these Marvel movies. I'm afraid for my sins I am, much to my wife's disappointment, I have to say, but I like them. And this, of course, is the Avengers. And if you watch any of the movies, you'll know what I mean. I think it's a really good analogy for diversity, because they're not all the same. They're all very different, and they don't always get along together. If you watch any of the movies, Captain America and Iron Man, they're always bickering. Or Thor, he's like a thunder god, so he's always like aloof and moody. And the Hulk, he hates everybody, doesn't he? I mean, he'll fight anybody, friend or foe. But the thing is, when it matters, they come together to form a team that's greater than the sum of its parts. That's the real value of diversity. If you think about an organisation, whether it's a small organisation, whether it's a large institution like yours, whether it's a multinational company, there's always like a hierarchy, there's like a pyramid. And at the base of the pyramid, there's often quite a lot of diversity. People working on the ground floor, people working at the sharp end, there's often quite a lot of diversity. But once you start going up that pyramid, once you start getting to the middle managers, once you start getting to the senior leadership team, directors, trustees, the diversity seems to diminish, and you get situations where everybody's the same. Everybody looks the same, everybody speaks the same language, everybody's been to the same sort of schools or universities. Everybody pretty much looks at the world the same way. They all share very similar points of view. When that organisation faces a challenge, all those people are going to be approaching the challenge from the same perspective, from the same point of view. But imagine you have diversity going right the way through the organisation. Different ages, different genders, different ethnicities, people with a disability, people without a disability, people with different sexualities, essentially people that have a different story to tell. People that have a different story to tell. When that organisation faces a challenge, all those people are going to be approaching it from different perspectives, which as an organisation is going to give you so many more potential outcomes, so many more potential solutions to whatever your challenge might be. That's the real value of diversity, whether it's in a small organisation or whether it's in society in general. But you know what? William Coffin is absolutely right when he says, diversity might be the hardest thing for a society to live with, but it's the most dangerous thing for a society to be without. Couldn't agree more. For me, equality is about fairness, but it's worth saying that fairness is not always about giving everyone the same thing. It's about giving each person what they need to succeed. But in essence, it is about trying for us all to try and create a fairer society. One of the things that, talk about national characteristics and things, fairness goes through lots of different countries and lots of different ethnicities. This sense of fair play, this sense of being fair, which is what we all aspire to. I'm sure we would all like to think of ourselves as fair-minded people. So fairness, create a society that's fair. A society where everyone has the same freedoms to participate as everyone else. A society where everyone has the same opportunities to achieve their potential, whatever their potential might be. You know what? I mean, whether you're a person of faith or whether you have no faith at all, I'm sure that what we can all agree on, what we know for certain, is that we have a finite amount of time on this planet. Well, what do we want to do with it? Well, ultimately, I would argue we want to fulfill our potential, whatever that potential happens to be. And you know what? We're hopefully just now coming to the end of this terrible pandemic, which seems to have been with us forever. Life is hard enough, isn't it? I mean, life throws enough challenges at us, left to its own devices, without us creating artificial barriers and artificial obstacles to put in people's paths. So surely we want a society where everyone has the same freedoms to fulfill their potential, whatever that might be. And a society that understands that we're all unique and special, but at the same time, wonderfully different. And it understands, it recognises, and it respects and celebrates that difference. Because that is what makes life worth living. Can you just imagine living in a world where everyone was the same? Yeah, everybody was the same. They all looked the same. They all thought the same. It would be hell on earth. It is people's differences that makes the world a wonderful place, makes the world a fascinating place, an interesting place, because everybody's different. It is so important that we kind of take on board the concept of equality and diversity. But it's also important to realise that in and of itself, it's no guarantee of inclusion. It doesn't guarantee belonging. Now, this is an old illustration, and I often feel now that I should apologise because it's been called out a few times for being tokenistic. And indeed it is, because it's quite an old illustration, and it is very much on my to-do list to sort of change it. But it has a value because it tells the story of a journey. And the journey really is from equality to inclusion. So here you go. You've got three little lads. They want to watch a game. In this case, it's a baseball game. But they can't because there's a barrier in the way. There's a fence in the way. So in order to achieve a degree of equality, you give them each a box to stand on. But equality is about fairness, and fairness is not always about giving everyone the same thing. So, okay, so you make some adjustments. Brilliant. Now you've achieved a degree of equity, in as much as they can all now see the game. But they're seeing the game over a fence. There is still a barrier. There is still an obstacle there. So, okay, you remove the fence. You get rid of the barrier. Well done, you. Now you've achieved a degree of liberation. But the boys are still on the outside looking in. There's no sense of inclusion. There's no sense of belonging. And this is the disconnect that often people find. You often get people who sit around a boardroom table and they're trying to fix a problem with a community group. And to be transparent and to embrace diversity, they invite members of the local community in. And they're all at the back of the room, or they're up in the gallery. And the people around the boardroom table feel quite pleased with themselves because they've been transparent, they're not trying to hide anything, and they've embraced diversity. But the people don't be at the back of the room. They don't want to be in the gallery. They need a seat at the table. They need to be part of the conversation. And you could argue that perhaps they need to be leading the conversation, and maybe some of the other people need to shut up and listen. So the thing about it, until you give those boys a uniform, until you make them part of the team, until you persuade them that they will be valued, that they will have a voice, that they will be listened to, there's no sense of inclusion. There's no sense of belonging. And Verna Myers, who's a very well-known American practitioner, she said, think about it like this. She said, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Big difference. So let me ask you a question. I always say about these questions because depending on the group, it might be appropriate to your organisation, it might not be. So you can think about it in a personal terms, or you can think about it just hypothetically. But let me ask you this question. Okay, so is this your normal? So I look at this picture. For me, this picture is very much my normal. If I saw this picture on any literature, on a website, on social media posts, nothing about this picture offends me or triggers me whatsoever. It's very much my normal. But you could say, maybe, is this your normal? Or is this your normal? Or how about as an older person, is this your normal? Or maybe this, is this your normal? Or is this your normal? Or as a younger person, is this your normal? Or maybe this? Or maybe this? And it is said that when people look at an organisation, they look to see, what does success look like? What does success look like? And is what you see what you get? Is what you see what you get? Because people say, if I don't see myself, then I don't think you're for me. If I don't see myself, I don't think you're for me. Okay. Hopefully that wasn't too painful for you all. We're going to do 2 breakout sessions this morning. The first one, it's a little bit of an icebreaker really. It's the first opportunity that you're going to have to talk amongst yourselves. The second breakout session after the break will be much more focused, because in the second session we will be talking about unconscious bias, we'll be talking about assumptions that we make, we'll be talking about different forms of prejudice and persecution and discrimination. So that second one was going to be a bit more focused, and it will give you opportunities to share your own experiences if you wish to. This first one is just an icebreaker. So I'm only going to give you like 10, 12 minutes. But I want you to think about equality, diversity and inclusion. I want you to think about how it is within your own organisation. I want you to think about this hierarchy. Is what you see what you get? Is it representative? When the outside world look at the college, is what you see what you get? Yeah. And in fact, anything else around equality, diversity that you would like to discuss amongst yourselves. So let's press on a little bit. Let's talk about this. This is an interesting concept, cultural competency. You'll see it in lots of sort of conversations around equality, diversity and inclusion. Cultural competency, sometimes called cultural awareness. You can do a Google search and you'll find a number of different definitions. But, you know, it can loosely be defined as our ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people who are different from us. People who have come from different cultures, people who have different belief systems, people who have a different way of looking at the world from the way that we look at the world. Now, there are 3 words there that I want you to focus on: understand, appreciate, and interact. They're the 3 crucial words, because it is great if you can have an understanding of people who are different. You can have an understanding of different cultures. That's great. It's even better, I would argue, if you can have an appreciation of difference. If you can appreciate people's culture, appreciate the differences. But it's in that 3rd word, the interact, the interactions, our daily interactions with people who are different from us. This is where the problems occur. In the language that we use, in the assumptions that we make, in the stereotypes that we buy into, in our unconscious biases. This is where sometimes it gets difficult. If you think about cultural competency really just pragmatically, and you can delve a lot deeper into it, I promise you, but it represents a willingness to just be a little bit more open, to be a little bit more aware, to try and build better understanding between people, to be respectful. Not a lot to ask, is it, to be respectful, to be open to different cultural perspectives. Always bearing in mind that you do not have to agree, and you certainly don't have to adopt them, or abandon yours, but you do have to give people the respect and be open. Well, it's the way you look at the world. It's not the way I look at the world, but yeah, hey, you know, every man to their own, live and let live, that's what I say. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? It represents this willingness to strive for better understanding, to be prepared to do the work, to be prepared to ask the questions of ourselves. Well, why did that trigger me? Why did that upset me? Why do I think that? Do you know, it's fascinating to me because as children, as young people, that's all we ever ask. Why? It's the question that all children ask continually, drives the parents crazy. Why? Why? Somehow when we become adults, we've got it all sussed. You know, this is the way the world is, this is what I think, these are my views, No one stops to say, well, why? Why do I think that? Why did that upset me? Why did that trigger? Why? Asking that question, trying harder to understand people and trying harder not to be misunderstood. It's horrible, isn't it? I don't think there's very few things worse in life than being misunderstood. You know, when your motives have been pure and genuine, and for whatever reason, they're misunderstood. People have just, just taken what you said and completely misunderstood you, sometimes kind of aggressively. And you feel this sense of injustice, don't you? You feel that it's so unfair. You know, I'm 69 years old. You can imagine, I can tell you loads of times when I've been misunderstood. But I will quickly share you one story that is still painful to me to this day. It was about 30 years ago, maybe 35 years ago. I was in very much an entrepreneurial phase of my life. I had a number of businesses. And on this particular occasion, I had a very important business meeting in London. It just so happens, though, that I was sick. When the meeting came due, I was sick, and I should have cancelled the meeting. But of course, young, up-and-coming entrepreneur, you don't cancel important business meetings. So I got in the car, I actually got off my sick bed, got in the car, I drove to London, I parked my car in Tesco's car park, and I walked the half a mile to the client's office that was in the very sort of upmarket, very palatial part of North London. Not dissimilar from parts of Cambridge, I have to say. Big houses, big front gardens. About halfway to his office, I was so unwell. I felt so unwell. I had to sit and rest, and I sat on somebody's low garden wall with my head in my hands, feeling absolutely dreadful. And I was vaguely aware of two elderly ladies who passed by on the pavement. And one turned to her friend and she said, "Don't you think that's disgusting, being drunk at this time of the day?" I didn't even have the strength to defend myself. I just had to sit there with my head in my hands, groaning, feeling this terrible sense of injustice that I had been so misunderstood. I was sick. I had made these sacrifices. I'd gotten off of my sick bed. And there were these people who judging me, thought I was drunk. It was horrible. It was a horrible feeling. What I want you to do next, though, is look at that picture on the screen. Just look at those people and think to yourself, for some people, being misunderstood is a daily occurrence. For some people, being misunderstood is a daily occurrence. You imagine walking down the street and somebody looks you up and down and they make a judgment about you, about your very worth as a human being. They make an assumption about you. I work a lot with young people, I think I said in my introduction. A young boy, John, young black guy, he's 16, he doesn't like going into his local supermarket very much. The reason he doesn't like going into his local supermarket is that every time he goes in there, he becomes very aware that the security guard has moved away from the front desk and appears to be following him around the supermarket. Even though it's his local supermarket, and they all know him in there, makes him feel very uncomfortable. Earlier this year, after the Christmas holidays, I was talking to two young black girls that I work with, and they had been up to Regent Street in London to do Christmas shopping. And they, very good-naturedly, bless them, told me how they went into quite an upmarket shop. And they said when we went in there, everything went quiet. And when we walked to the desk, the sales assistant rather pointedly started telling them how much things cost because she made an assumption about them and their ability to pay. And she said, we didn't stay long because we felt really uncomfortable. She said it was almost like they were saying, well, if you go down the road, a few hundred yards, you'll find a pound shop. There might be something down there that might be more suitable. Imagine that. Can you imagine that? Having your very worth as a human being questioned. For some people, being misunderstood is a daily occurrence. Cultural competency helps us. It helps us if we strive for better understanding and try harder not to be misunderstood. As human beings, we do make assumptions. It's natural. But where do we go with the assumptions? That sales assistant, if I'm being brutally honest, the assumptions that she made about the two young people were probably pretty accurate, really. They probably couldn't afford to buy the things in the shop. So her assumption was probably correct. but she didn't have to act on it. She could have been professional, she could have been pleasant, she could have been nice, welcoming. She didn't have to act on those assumptions. She had an assumption and she acted it out, which resulted in people's feelings being hurt, people feeling diminished, people feeling that they weren't welcome, people feeling uncomfortable, people feeling misunderstood. If we ask the $65,000 question, how do we achieve cultural competency? Believe me, I would like nothing better than to say, right, have you got some pen and a paper? I will tell you. No. You know that that's not going to happen, don't you? You just know that. Pamela Hayes is absolutely right when she says cultural competency is a lifelong project. We have to keep finding ways to expand our learning. We have to keep finding ways to be better. How do we do that? Lots of ways. Doing training like this, of course, that helps. Widening your network. That's sometimes easier said than done. But if you think about your own bubble, your own little circle of friends, not your family, but your wider acquaintances, how diverse are they? How much diversity is there in your bubble? Or are they all people like you? Because if we expand our network, we find out about difference, we learn, we improve. Making sure that the organisation is willing to do the work, to get signed up, and striving for authentic values, because they've been identified. There are lots of really good values that are associated with cultural competency. So curiosity. How are you ever going to find out if you can't be asked? If you're not interested, you're never going to find out, are you? You need to be curious about, well, why do people do it that way? Or why do you think that? And why? Well, how come those people have that view of the world and that's different from why? Be curious. Empathy. This thing about walking a mile in someone else's shoes, very, very important. For me, empathy, I tend to view empathy as like a bit of like a circuit breaker. Because I'm a 69-year-old white straight man. I have lots of baggage. When I went to school, boys did woodwork and girls did cookery. It's part of my cultural iceberg. Doesn't necessarily make me a bad person, but I do have to be mindful about it, particularly in my interactions with young women, in the language that I might inadvertently use, in the assumptions that I might make. It's part of my cultural iceberg. So we do have to kind of explore that. For me, this empathy is like a circuit breaker. It enables me to take a breath before I judge, to take a breath before I act on an assumption, before I buy into a stereotype, before I use language that might be offensive or that people might feel offended if I use. A circuit breaker. Sometimes it's just a wafer thin, because if we start a conversation and you start telling me about a view that you hold, that I'm relaxed about, I'm ambivalent about, well, I'm more than happy to give you all the space you need. But if you start talking about something that contradicts a core belief of mine, I'm much less willing to hear you out. I want to shut you down. I want to stop listening. So that circuit breaker gives you that pause, even though it might be just wafer thin. It's really, really important. Kindness. Goodness me. Isn't kindness underrated? You don't get very high up on a business manifesto, is it? We want our business to be a kinder business. Persistence and patience. Yeah, we'll talk about institutional racism a bit later. It's not going to be unpicked anytime soon. You need persistence and you need patience. I was called out recently. Somebody said, oh no, you need to be active. You need to be an activist. Yeah, no good just being patient. You need to be an activist. You need to do something now. Absolutely right. Occasionally, you do need to have courage. You need to put your head above the parapet and speak truth to power. But things will not change instantly. They take time. So you do need to be patient and you do need to be persistent. Always be humble. Please don't come to me for all the answers because I'm still learning myself. And you need to be sensitive. Really, really important. We're human beings. As such, we're all by definition a work in progress. Not everybody's naturally accepting or naturally empathic. In the UK, we have laws in place that are designed to protect us against the worst forms of discrimination. It's called the Equality Act 2010. There's been anti-discrimination legislation around for the last few hundred years, going right the way back to the abolition of slavery. It's gone through the 60s, through the 70s with various legislation around disability, around equal pay. It's gone virtually up to date, so a lot of the legislation that you see around the 2000s are to do with sexual identity and protection against people with diverse sexualities. In 2010, a lot of that legislation was combined and put under the umbrella of the Equality Act 2010. So they were amalgamated all under one piece of overarching legislation. It protects people against discrimination, and the way it works, and I'm guessing if you've done any safeguarding training or any of this sort of training before, you'll be familiar with the protected characteristics, but here they are. If you're not, it's age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. And if you have one or more of those 9 protected characteristics, you have a degree of protection under the Equality Act in law. The way it works, it identifies direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and something called associative discrimination and perceptive discrimination. Direct discrimination is pretty much discrimination as most people would understand it. It's discrimination with intent. So I didn't get the job because I was black. I didn't get the promotion because I was a woman. I was not chosen for this prestigious assignment because they found out I was gay. All examples, along with a few more on the screen there, of direct discrimination. Indirect discrimination, I always find this really interesting because it's quite subtle. It is often discrimination without intent. It's often innocent. It's often the result of a policy change or a new policy that an organisation adopts, which on the face of it might seem perfectly reasonable, but when you drill down, it unfairly impacts upon somebody who has one or more of the 9 protected characteristics. They're unintended consequences. And if we think about discrimination by association and by perception, you're facing discrimination in the workplace because you're having to take a lot of time off work to care for your son, your daughter, your partner who has complex needs. You don't have complex needs, but you're associated with somebody who does, and therefore you face discrimination in the workplace. Or by perception. You're getting bullied. People are sending you inappropriate emails, making jokes behind your back because a rumour has gone round that you're gay. Actually, doesn't make any difference if you are or if you're not. There is a perception that you are, and therefore you're facing discrimination because of it. Harassment, however you want to pronounce it, it violates a person's dignity, essentially. That's the definition under the Equality Act. It creates a hostile, toxic, intimidating atmosphere in any environment. It could be physical, it could be sending inappropriate emails, it could be telling jokes, it could be bullying, it could be anything. Unfortunately, often it is of a sexual nature, but it doesn't always have to be. It could be to do with age, it could be to do with disability, it could be to do with any number of things. But it basically violates a person's dignity, creates a toxic work environment for them. And victimisation, the last one, it's an interesting one again because you've made a complaint. You've blown the whistle. And as the result of blowing the whistle, making a complaint, you face renewed discrimination. You should not face renewed discrimination if you have made a complaint under the Equality Act. You do have protection. Where does it apply? Pretty much everywhere, really. There are very few examples where the Equality Act doesn't come into effect. In healthcare, hospitals, organisations like your own, universities, schools, colleges. In transport, buses, trains. If you join a club, if you join like a tennis club and you pay fees, you're protected under the Equality Act. and certainly public bodies, local government, government institutions, all of those are under the auspices of the Equality Act. It is illegal, unlawful, to discriminate against someone if they have one or more of the 9 protected characteristics. But like much legislation, there is always wiggle room, and there are exceptions. And where the Equality Act is concerned, they're called GOQs, genuine occupational qualifications. So you see it in counselling quite a lot, domestic abuse, rape counselling. You often find that those organisations are single-sex working environments, and that is reflected in their recruitment policy. In the same way that faith schools, if you're a Catholic school and you're advertising for a deputy head, then you are almost certainly going to want somebody of the Catholic faith. It's not rocket science, really. It is a negotiation. It's not cast in stone. I could apply for a job and not get the job, and I could say, well, it's because of my age. There would have to be a conversation, and the company would have to make their case that I didn't get the job because there were genuine occupational qualifications that I did not meet. It's not a perfect piece of legislation. Quite recently, somebody who does a lot of work in this area said to me, did I not think the Equality Act was a toothless tiger? That's how they explained it. Of course, what they're talking about is that over the last, I don't know how many years, there's been a gradual dilution in legal aid. So the point he was making is, did I think that it was possible for somebody to face discrimination in the workplace, but because they couldn't access legal aid, they wouldn't be able to pursue their case? They just physically wouldn't have the money to pursue it. I guess in theory, that's possible. It depends how far down the line you go. In my experience, I've never been on the receiving end of an employment tribunal or an industrial tribunal, but I have sat on a number of panels, and it is very heavily weighted towards the claimant, in my experience. I can't speak for all tribunals, but all the ones that I've sat on, the sympathy, the empathy, the support is always for the plaintiff, the person who's made the claim. Because often the organisation, they arrive and they're lawyered up. I went to one before Christmas. There were four barristers, and there was this one, person who had been, shafted, to want of a better word, by the organisation. 4 barristers they brought. So in my experience, there's quite a lot of support through ACAS and other organisations. So yes, in theory, legal aid does have an impact, the fact that it's being diminished, but you still have quite a lot of protection. One thing I do know for sure, though, is when it goes wrong, it's expensive. It's expensive from the organisational point of view, both in financial terms and in reputational terms. So it's really, really important that you stay on the right side of the Equality Act. There's a lot of good follow-up material, but I'm sure, everybody within the HR realm, within the college, will be fully aware of that. But yeah, important that we understand it. Okay, and that is rather nicely taken us to a break. Okay, excellent. Right, well, let's push on. I did say to you right at the beginning that it was very much a game of 2 halves. Hopefully, none of you found the first half particularly distressing. The second half's a bit more contentious, in as much as I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit, because I said at the beginning, one of the things asking this question, why? Why did that trigger me? Why did I get upset about that? Why do I think that? So this is the thing that we're going to look at in the second half, really. So hopefully, in the first hour and a half, I've left you in no doubt as to where I stand on these issues, how important I think the conversation is, how I think that discussing things about fairness and about equality and about human rights, how they're fundamental things that we should explore and we should try and embrace. But I think it's also fair to say that not everybody shares that view. And the world is very polarised. I was talking to somebody during the break, and we were talking about how it's like across the pond in our cousins in America, and it's so stark how polarised, the views in that country are, and not everybody embraces it. So when we talk about equality, diversity, people are apt to say, well, isn't it all a bit squidgy? It's all a bit soft, isn't it? It's all a bit liberal. Yeah, it's all a bit political, all a bit socialist. It's all a bit woke. Now, I don't know about you, but the first time that I came upon the word woke was a long time ago. It's been around for a while now, and I looked it up. And the definition that I found at the time was, I was sleeping, but now I'm woke. So in other words, my eyes have been opened. I'm just perhaps a little bit more aware of social injustice in the world. And I thought, well, do you know what? That works for me. I'm quite happy with that definition. It's not what it means now, is it? I'm not sure I could even tell you what it means now. But it's very much designated as a negative term. People are accused, aren't they, of being woke. The trouble with the world is there's too many wokers. That's the trouble. It's all too woke. And for me, it fits very nicely alongside other terms like that, like cancel culture and racial theory, replacement theory, critical race theory, and of course our old friend, politically correct. Because people get triggered, people get upset. People say, did you see that thing on the news the other day? You can't fly the Union Jack anymore. It's absolutely ridiculous. You can't fly the Union Jack anymore. It's political correctness gone mad, people say. Triggers people. This is my granddad. This is actually a picture of my grandfather. Long, long gone now, of course. He was a lovely man. I loved my granddad. But I tell you something, if he was alive now, he would be one of the people saying, International Women's Day. International Women's Day, what's that all about? Load of rubbish, if you ask me. Load of rubbish, if you ask me. And then you turn around and you get people say, well, why don't we have an International Men's Day then? What's all that about? Why don't we have It triggers people. People get enraged by it. Black History Month. Goodness me, didn't that enrage people? Well, why don't we have a White History Month then? That's what I want to know. Why don't we have a White History Month? And Black Lives Matter. Don't even get me started on Black Lives Matter. People taking the knee. Well, of course, it's just gesture politics, isn't it? It's all political. It's all just like a publicity stunt, isn't it? And for goodness sake, I mean, all lives matter, don't they? All lives matter. It makes me tired, to be honest with you. Actually makes me tired. Talib Kweli, who's a very well-known rapper and poet, he expresses it much more eloquently than I can. He says, think about it like this. If I say my house is on fire, and you say, well, of course, all houses matter. And I say, well, yeah, that might be true, but all houses are not on fire right now. My house is. And that's why Black Lives Matter. I look at where I am in the world. I'm privileged. Nobody's kicking my bin over. No one's strewn in rubbish on my garden. No one's got a spray can out and is spraying "go home" on my wall. My house is not on fire. But I try to strive for understanding and appreciate that for many people, their houses are on fire. And that's why Black Lives Matter. It's not rocket science, but it does trigger people in the same way that LGBTQ and transgender issues trigger people. They enrage people. And people see a gay pride march in Cambridge and they say, well, why don't we have a straight pride march then? Why don't we have a straight pride march? I can tell you, if you're interested, if 1 in 5 straight people experienced a hate crime based on their sexuality, then maybe there would be a need for a straight pride march. Yeah, if straight people, like myself, had to experience the daily discrimination, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, on a daily basis, then maybe there would be a need for a march. If you can show me the evidence, I'll help you organise one. But it triggers people. And people say, oh, it's all political correctness. Political correctness gone mad. Think about political correctness in historical terms. There could have easily been, at the turn of the century, a gentleman very much like that, at the Corn Exchange, furiously clutching his copy of today's London Times and bemoaning the fact that they're talking about giving women the vote. It's political correctness gone mad. You know that I have many factories. You know what? They're telling me now I can't send children as young as 9 into my factories. It's political correctness gone mad. It's political correctness gone mad. Unless we challenge, unless we question, we'll never get any social change. What seems absurd several years ago, now not so strange. It's clumsy, of course it is. But I can promise you something. It is better than what we had before. I told you, showed you that picture of Canning Town Market. My school was a stone's throw away from that market, and at 5 o'clock on market day, I used to get up and help the traders set their stalls up. But in my school, one year, 1964, 1965, we had a young Indian boy join our class. His name was Verinder Mukherjee. And our teacher, mind, said, I can't pronounce your name, I'm going to call you Gangadin. For the whole term, when he did registration, he referred to him as Gangadin. His name was Verinder Mukherjee. As human beings, we just need to be a bit more mindful about this thing that we all do, which is called whataboutism. We're very apt to do it. Oh, hang on a second. No, hang on a second. Well, what about we do it all the time, you know? Nobody talked about all lives mattering until there was talk of Black Lives Matter. You know, nobody talked about championing straight pride because that was the status quo until you have gay pride. You know, nobody talked about having a White History Month until there was a Black History Month. And nobody gave a fig about trying to promote men's rights and how, as a man, I don't have enough say in the world until there's a conversation around feminism and women's rights. This whataboutism is toxic. We all do it, but hang on a second. Well, what about this? What about that? I did a marathon a few years ago, and I tried to get somebody in our department. This is while I was still working for the local authority. And a woman said, well, I'm not being funny, Steve, but there's starving children in this country. It was for children in Africa. As though, you know, it was like you have to do one or other. You know, why can't you do both? It was like, well, you know, I'm not going to give you money to feed children in Africa because there's children in this country. You know, what about our children? Well, yeah, great. Let's sort out our children, but it doesn't mean that we can't help everybody. You know, why does it have to be a choice, one thing or the other? Sorry, it was a bit of a rant there, I apologise. Let's talk about language, because I think, as I said at the beginning, you know, this thing about, oh, you know, not showing what to say, you know, sometimes I feel like I'm treading on eggshells. There is an evolution in language. It follows society. So where disability is concerned, words that were inappropriate years ago, society's view on disability has changed, so the language has changed as well. We talk about people being wheelchair users. We don't talk about people being wheelchair bound anymore. We don't use words like spastic anymore. You know, we don't bandy these words around. We're a little bit more mindful about our language. You know, like I say, that's Rathbone Market. You can imagine the language that was commonplace in that market in the 60s. You can imagine the sort of language that was commonplace in the playground, in the school that I went to. Language and words that were okay then are now considered beyond the pale now, because language evolves. It's very, very nuanced. So language is often contextual. It often is depending on text, on context. And when we talk about microaggressions, we'll explore that a little bit more. But it does evolve. And this is interesting, how words evolve. So take a word like homosexual. Now, if we were to do a quick straw poll, we won't do it, but if we were to do a straw poll and say, hands up, anybody who considers the word homosexual to be offensive. I would willingly wager that probably not too many people would put their hand up. It may or may not surprise you to know that since about 2013, which is when things started to change, certainly within the LGBT community, the word homosexual was considered to be offensive. And it has evolved into using words like gay man or gay men. But what is interesting is the word in the third column, queer. Now, when I went to school, that was considered to be offensive. You called someone a queer, you were being offensive to them. It was a derogatory word. There's a thing called appropriation, which, if you look at it in its crudest terms, it's summed up by the saying, only black people can use the N-word. So if you watch any kind of hard-edge American TV film that features young black men in it, they will use the N-word amongst themselves. So only black people can use the N-word. Words that were considered offensive were adopted and used as a badge of honour. So the word queer has been used within the LGBT community for a number of years within the community. But what is really interesting now is it's bursting out of the bubble. And in many quarters, it's considered acceptable. If you go on LinkedIn, if you follow any kind of discussions around LGBTQ issues, you will see people referring to themselves as queer and using the word queer openly in the conversation. To me, it still has a lot of baggage, and I'm not comfortable with it. So if somebody says to me, oh, you know what, LGBTQ, what does the Q stand for? I always say questioning, which is perfectly acceptable. But language evolves. It becomes very nuanced. And the latest example, of course, of language evolving is pronouns. Pronouns. If you look at my bio on the Diversity Trust website, you will see that I use pronouns. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you will see that I use pronouns. If you pick me up on Twitter or Facebook, no pronouns. And if you send me an email, I don't use pronouns on my email signature. Well, why the inconsistency? It's because I'm still learning. I'm a 69-year-old white man. Where do I fit in the conversation around pronouns? Where do I fit? I'm happy to share this with you. So they are certainly becoming more common. You see it more and more on people's bios, in emails, when people present themselves. Much more common now, particularly among young people. They do seem to represent a small and an easy way to normalise the conversation. This is what we want to do with all these things that are considered taboo or uncomfortable. We want to somehow find ways to normalise them, to talk about them. They allow people who are transgender, people who are non-binary, they allow those people from those communities, to let other people know how they wish to be identified and avoid them being misgendered. Well, remember the conversation about cultural competency. For misgendered, read misunderstood. Avoid misunderstanding and hope to foster better understanding. If you're like me, somebody who's quite comfortable with the gender they were assigned at birth, it's called cisgender. If you're cis, if you see people being described as cis, essentially it means they're somebody who's comfortable with the gender they were assigned at birth.
Can I ask you a question? When was that word invented?
The word? Yeah. Been around for a while now. I couldn't tell you. It's like a lot of language. It sort of suddenly kind of appears and starts to become more and more abound.
So once you've learned all these words, which seems to be hundreds of them, and then people of this community start changing those words, I'm not really comfortable with that, or get another load of words.
Well, surely are we not always learning? When do we stop learning?
We want to.
It's trying to be open, to just kind of think, well, all right, you'll relate, I'm sure perhaps you will or will not relate to this. I was doing this talking about pronouns, and somebody said, Steve. I don't understand. Sorry, what is it you don't understand? I don't understand any of it. What do you mean you don't understand what a pronoun is, or you don't understand why people would use them? He said, I don't understand any of it. It is complicated, it is difficult. And we sometimes live in a world where we feel, hang on a second, people are changing the rules all the time. It's difficult. The reason that I haven't gone all in with pronouns is that I'm still learning. I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to kind of just say, all right, well, that was then, okay, so it's changed. Okay, all right, let me try and catch up. Let me try and understand. You don't have to be part of the conversation, you know. Anybody can just step out of the conversation at any time and say, right, well, actually, you know, I'm not going to get involved in that conversation. Freedom of speech is important. Freedom of thought is important. You know, nobody wants to dragoon anybody into, you know, believing a certain thing or following a certain way of life. So it's a personal choice. That's why I use them in some instances and not in others. Happy to speak to you afterwards about it, though. And if you're particularly interested in this part of the conversation, there's several really good articles in the follow-up material which you can have a read about, which do give you a little bit of context about how the use of pronouns has evolved and what people's views are on it. It's worth saying, Andrew, that many people sort of, you know, share a contradictory view. You know, like I don't agree with it, or I don't, and they explain why. And that's fine, because it's interesting and important that we sometimes look at both sides of the argument. But thank you for that. It's also, interestingly enough, though, when I did work for the City Council, it does allow somebody who has a gender ambiguous name to let other people know how they wish to be addressed. Because when I worked for the council, I worked in sports development. And one time I got an email from somebody called Di Thomas, who wanted to talk to me about a rugby initiative in schools. And I connected the dots in my head, and in my head I could see this 6'4", you know, male Welsh rugby player. And of course we exchanged emails. And then the time came for a meeting, my phone rang, and my visitor's here. And I went out into reception and scanned reception, as you do, looking for this 6'4" rugby player. And all I could see was this rather petite blonde woman, who of course was Di Thomas. I can't help thinking, you know, if pronouns had been around then, I wouldn't have made that mistake. Language can bring people together. It's powerful. It's a powerful tool. It can bring people together. But it can also exclude and demonize people. So in the case of I can't pronounce your name, I'm going to call you Gunga Din. It can demonize people. And it's never more apparent, that demonization, in verbal transactions, which are called microaggressions. Now, I'll make an assumption that people do know what a microaggression is, but there's a definition on the screen there. It is perceived to be an act of exclusion. It's worth saying that it is often innocent, it's often well-meaning, but it is the innocent things that people do that often exclude people who have marginalised identities. It can be environmental, it can be behavioural, but more often than not, it is verbal. It's the innocent things that we say. And I freely confess, it is something that gives people an awful lot of angst. People don't understand microaggressions because it's like, this is the classic one. Where are you from? Well, what on earth is wrong with saying to somebody, where are you from? Where are you from? London. No. I mean, like, where are you really from? London. I was born in London. No. I get that. But like, where are you really from? You know. Okay. The problem with a microaggression. Okay, let me try and nail it for you. It is to do with context. It's to do with timing. It's to do with situation. It's to do with familiarity. We all look at the world different ways. Something that somebody says to me, I'm completely okay with that. I say exactly the same thing to somebody else. they perceive it to be a microaggression. It's perception, okay? So an example, I did this training a while back, and a young black guy said to me, well, of course, when I meet my peers, they always ask me where I'm from, because they want to know, have I come from one of the Caribbean islands? Am I African? Am I African American? But it's a completely different environment. It's a completely different dynamic than if that person was asked the same question by somebody else. It does depend on circumstance, it really does. But the thing about microaggressions and the way that we look at the world is, I look at the world a certain way, and I make an assumption that everybody looks at the world the same way. So, but not everybody does. And something that I might be offended by, somebody else might not, and vice versa. I don't like giving anybody any tips or tricks, but this goes back to cultural competency. Something that I do, when I meet somebody that I perceive to be different from me, and I find a question's forming in my mind, I first ask myself, how many times do I think this person's been asked that question? How many times do I think that person's been asked that question? And then I try and think really hard of a different question to ask. Where are you from? Mexico. Oh, do you know what? I love Mexico. We went there for our honeymoon. We went to that place on the coast. What's it called? And they cooked us this meal. What's that thing that you guys eat, you know, with the peppers and the chili? You open your mouth, and if you're not careful, you open this Pandora's box. And all this assumptions, all this unconscious bias kind of just tumbles out. Not only have you made that person other, but you've put them in a position where they feel that they are the sole representative for everything to do with Mexico. You just need to be a little bit more mindful. When we do our last breakout session, I'll be really interested in your thoughts on microaggressions, because it's quite a contentious discussion, and a lot of people are like, you know, I don't think that's a thing, and I don't see why that's wrong. I'm not so sure why you should say that. Be interested in getting your points of view. But I promise you, there are lots of them about. And pretty much, women as a gender, microaggressions are a big thing. Young people, big thing. I did a thing the other day, and a young woman, she said, she was a professor, and she said, people come up and they assume she's a volunteer because she's young, you know. She's a young woman, so she can't be a professor, can she? She must be one of the volunteers. Young people, I couldn't even tell you the last time I was on the receiving end of a microaggression. They go right over my head. It's not something I have to worry about. But when I work with young people, they often describe microaggressions are like death by 1,000 cuts, something that they have all the time. And in education, I'm sure you can relate to this. Young people that arrive, perhaps English is not their first language. Microaggressions are having a huge impact on their ability to study, you know, their mental health, their well-being. Been lots of studies around education about the impact of microaggressions. And show you, if you still can't quite get your head around a microaggression, there's a very, quite a nice little video.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
oh, you're so well-spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while...
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date...
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
Going grocery shopping...
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
Commuting to work...
So when are you gonna have a baby?
Watching TV...
We have to keep the Redskins' name. It's part of our culture and history.
Or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love shared...
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
Okay, so hopefully that kind of puts it a little bit in context for you. And I'm sorry, I meant to give you a health warning that there was a bit of bad language there, so I apologise for that. Hope nobody was too offended by that remark. But yeah, it is annoying for people. Some recommendations. In the follow-up material, there's a whole list of book recommendations, but I would seriously urge you to check out these ones if it's something that you're interested in finding out a little bit more about. 59 Things Not to Say to Your Black Friend is a great book, very funny book, and also very useful. And Tiffany Janet and Michael Barron's Subtle Acts of Exclusion is good. And Susie's book, Explaining Microaggressions, is a relatively new book, really, really good book. So I'd recommend those. Okay. All right, let me tell you a story. Quick story. I have a sip of my green tea before it gets too cold. Okay. I've spent a bit of time with you now, good couple of hours. Perhaps you've got a little bit of a handle on me, sort of person I am. Yes, I am a 69-year-old white man, straight white man. But I do feel I need to tell you that my wife is black. And when we met, she was 16 and I was 17. And if you don't believe me, this is a picture of us taken in the 60s. I'm quite happy to stand back and wait for the wow, because yes, I know. A young James Dean, I've been described as. And look at that hair, look. It makes my current situation all the more pitiable, really. But there you are. That was us 69 years ago. Well, not 69 years ago, but a long time ago. Seems like a long time ago. The white community did not want us to be together. Please take that as read. But rather disappointingly, the black community didn't want us to be together either, which I personally found quite disappointing because I was quite hoping to be adopted, but it wasn't to be. We moved further into London. We spent many happy evenings at the Brixton Academy listening to bands. We went to the Brixton Academy. In the 70s, it was a wonderful time to be a mixed-race couple in London. It was like licorice all sorts. There was differences everywhere. And we stayed together. This is a more recent picture of us. All I will say is the woman has the patience of a saint, and then I will leave it there. But the story I'm going to tell you is around everyday assumptions. So we go and do our regular shopping, and we usually go to a shopping mall in Bury St Edmunds, if you know Bury St Edmunds. We do our normal shopping together, and then if time allows, we generally go our separate ways, because one of us likes to look at shoes and handbags, and one of us likes to find the nearest bookshop and look at books. Please check out the name on the slide. Please don't make your own assumptions. When we do, we usually agree to meet back at the clock tower. And my wife always gets there first for some reason. And when I arrive, she's almost always in conversation with somebody. And it's not just it's an animated conversation. She laughs, her arms are going everywhere. She's having this huge conversation, laughing, so much so that I make an assumption. The assumption I make is that she's met a long-lost school friend, someone that she hasn't seen for years. When I get there and I say, who was that? She says the same thing. I don't know, just somebody I started a conversation with. Because what you need to know about my wife is that she loves everybody. On this occasion, however, though, it wasn't quite so nice, because I arrived and she was talking to a middle-aged woman with a clipboard. And I could see as soon as I arrived that there was some awkwardness. She wasn't laughing, she wasn't an animated conversation, it was quite serious. So much so that I thought, actually, I'm not quite sure what's going on here, maybe I should go over and find out what's happening. But before I could go over, the woman rather hurriedly put the clipboard away, and off she went. And when I went over, I said, is everything all right? And she said, I think I've just had a racist incident. So I said, why, what happened then? I won't go into all the details, but Suffice it to say, the woman was quite offensive. You know, why are you in this country? What are you doing? You know, coming over here, taking all our jobs. Even though my wife is retired, but and my wife loves everybody, so you know she was great. Took it much better than I would have done, I have to say. Anyway, in order to extradite herself from this uncomfortable conversation, the woman with the clipboard ultimately said, "Well, I mean, what's happening now? What are you doing right now?" And my wife said, "I'm just waiting for my husband to come back." At that moment in time, a rather tall, rather good-looking black guy happened to be coming across the shopping mall in their general direction. And the woman with the clipboard said, "Oh, well, here comes your husband now." And my wife turned to the woman and said, "Well, I think you're making an assumption there. Because if you look over there, you see that old boy who's shuffling his way across the shopping mall? That's actually my husband." We laugh about it now. I say my wife took it in very good humour, much more than I would have done. But I think it's an example of assumptions that we all make as human beings. I would hopefully we don't always open our mouth quite that big and put our foot in it, but we all do make assumptions. It's unconscious bias. It's something that all of us have, whether we appreciate it, whether we acknowledge it, or whether we don't. And it's why, as human beings, we instinctively like people who look like us. We gravitate around people who look like us, have the same view of the world as we do. We're much more comfortable with people who are like us. It's a lot to do with the way our brains work. Our brains are bombarded with literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of bits of information. Our brains can't possibly process them all at once. We need to find ways of dealing with that. So what our brain does is it forges shortcuts. Well, where does it get the information from? It gets it from this thing called our cultural iceberg, which has been forming since the day we were born. How our parents taught us, our local community, the schools that we went to, all the influences that come to bear that focus on our cultural iceberg and grow it. And in that cultural iceberg are our core beliefs and our core values. And the answer to why certain things trigger us, why certain things don't. That's where the brain gets the information from. Now don't get me wrong, shortcuts can be useful because they can enable us to make quick decisions, and that's great. But if we constantly use the shortcut, we never bother going the long way around. So we never bother to ask why. We're just quite happy to keep taking the shortcut. By doing that, it can very easily lead us into the murky waters of discrimination and prejudice, really easily. Keep taking the shortcut, never bother going the long way around. Why would you? Why would you? Then you never find out what's out there. We're going to do our last breakout session now. I'm going to show you some pictures. This is not a quiz. It's not a test, promise you. It's just to ask yourself, quietly, internally, what's going on here? If you were going to meet these two young women, you have no other information, Are you already making your mind up about their relationship? Are you already starting to form the narrative in your head? Or maybe not. How about this young person? New student. That's all you get, that picture. Are you already making an assumption? The sort of person they are? What's going on here? We all make assumptions, but sometimes we let our assumptions get the better of us. Or how about this one? Now, I will share my own feelings on this because I found this picture probably 6 or 8 months ago. The first time I saw the picture, I thought drug abuse. And then I smiled to myself and I laughed out loud. And I thought, hang on a second, where did that come from? Where did drug abuse come from? And you intellectualize it, don't you? You think, oh, okay, well, tattoos, hair, pained expression, earring. So, for all you know, this person might have been run over by a bus. For all you know, this person might be in hospital having their appendix out. Where did drug abuse come from? Where? I found that really interesting. And this is another one, and this is I promise you, this is a true story. Sometimes when people do the breakout sessions, they reference the pictures. Sometimes they don't. One time, somebody came back and said, well, in our room, we really like the picture of the two brothers with the baby. Couldn't really tell from your picture up there if it was a boy or a girl, but we just thought it was a really nice picture, you know, two brothers with their niece or nephew. Great. A different presentation on a different day, and this is perfectly true, I promise you, we spent 15 minutes talking about why gay people shouldn't be allowed to adopt children, why people from the LGBT community shouldn't be allowed to adopt. Well, when did I tell you they were gay? When did that little nugget of information get conveyed? We do make assumptions. We do make assumptions. So it's asking yourself to do that. I'm quite conscious of the time, so I'm going to skip ahead, if I may, and just go on to this next one. And so we'll do the next breakout session now. I'll leave that on the screen. So I did promise you in the second one it would be a bit more focused with a little bit more to unpick. So what have we talked about? Well, we talked about language and how language is evolving. I'd be interested in getting your views, particularly on pronouns, on your tables. What do you think about pronouns? We talked about unconscious bias. What's your feeling on unconscious bias? Can you think of a time when you've allowed your own unconscious bias to affect your decision-making process? Or perhaps you've been on the receiving end of somebody else's unconscious bias. What about microaggressions? What's your feeling on microaggressions? Do you think they're a thing? Can you think of an opportunity, a time when you've been on the receiving end of a microaggression? Does it happen to you? Have you unwittingly perpetrated a microaggression? Do you think they're even a thing? Be interested in your views. The reason that this is important, the critical reason it's important, is we do need to be very wary of prejudice. And as human beings, we are all prejudiced. It doesn't always mean that it's toxic prejudice. We all have our little biases, we have our little leanings, we have our little sort of predilections to sort of certain things. So we all exhibit prejudice. And Alden is absolutely right when he says, if I knew what my prejudices were, I probably wouldn't have them. But they are, as human beings, this tendency we have as human beings to prejudge. And this prejudging is based on a lack of life experience. The more we know, the better we can understand. And it's like, I did a session a while back. It was an online session. And on the call was a guy, and he was a big boy. He had a shaven head, he had lots of tattoos. He was a big boy, he liked his gym, and he was from Serbia. And we joked online about stereotypes and about how, you know, he kind of in many ways, he fitted the stereotype of, you know, someone from Serbia who's like a drug dealer or a gangster or someone like that. And we talked about it, and he loved his country, as you can imagine. And he said, oh, you must come to Serbia, and I'll show you around, and you can meet my family, and I'll show you the sights. And well, had I taken him up on his offer, I would have learnt so much about Serbia and the Serbian people. And then later on, if I'd have said to somebody, oh, I'm going to Serbia for my holidays, and they said to me, oh, you wouldn't catch me going to Serbia, you're going to get murdered, aren't you? You're going to get, you know, kidnapped and held to ransom, you know. And I would be able to say, well, actually, that's not my understanding, that's not my experience of Serbia. So the more we understand, you know, the more we increase our understanding, the more we increase, you know, our knowledge. But it is typical of human beings that we prejudge. And a lot of it is instinctive. As human beings, if we don't understand something, we're often afraid of it. And if we're afraid of it, that can be disastrous in terms of how we behave. But it's been around forever, hasn't it? I mean, prejudice, anti-Semitism, it's been around forever. In the follow-up material, there's a lot of information. If you only read one thing to do with prejudice, read Heather Salting's article that she wrote for Harper's Bazaar. She talks about how she was 12 years old when she first became aware of anti-Semitism. Somebody called her a dirty Jewish pig on Facebook. She says when she goes out into the street, she has to be quite wary of wearing the Star of David. And if she's in a room with people, she has to read the room before she's comfortable talking about her religion. The thing that really resonated with me She wrote the article in 2020, not 1920, but 2020. Really powerful article. Prejudice around faith. As long as there's been religion, people have been prejudiced and discriminated against and victimized because of their religion. Islamophobia, after 9/11 and after the Manchester Arena bombings, huge increase in hate crime of that particular faith. I read a study recently that they said over a 10-month period, they logged nearly 500 racist or anti-Islamic tweets a day over a 10-month period. LGBTQ, as I say, it's a subject that I still find uncomfortable, difficult to talk about because of my upbringing. But people from that community are constantly facing prejudice, hate crime based on their sexuality. And disability. I mean, I work with disability. I can't get my head around why you would push someone in a wheelchair over. I just can't. Or why you would be abusive to somebody who had Down syndrome. I just can't intellectualize it at all in my head. It's something called ableism. You feel that you are superior. You don't have a disability, they do. Therefore, by definition, they are somehow less than you. It's the cornerstone of all privilege, of all prejudice, I should say. You feel a privilege and you are superior to somebody else, you know, in respect of ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of your sexuality, in terms of your physicality. You see yourself as superior. And if you take that to extreme, that gives you the right to be anywhere from dismissive to outright prejudicial towards them. The reason that we need to have this conversation is to really explore stereotypes, because all of us buy into stereotypes. And, you know, I'm not going to, go through a whole list of stereotypes. You know what a stereotype is. But we all tend to buy into them, and different people buy into different stereotypes depending on their life experience. But if we don't challenge them, if we embrace unconscious bias, if we embrace stereotyping, it becomes very convenient, because then we can just put everyone in a box. We can put everyone in a box and stick a label on them. How convenient is that? Put everybody in a box, stick a label on them. Great. What's wrong with that? What that leads to is scapegoating. Now, everything that's going wrong in my life, everything that's going wrong in my world, I can just easily attribute to one of these boxes. And if we just get rid of that box, and get rid of that box, and get rid of these boxes, goodness gracious me, wouldn't my life be better? Wouldn't my life be simpler? Have that view if you wish. But far too many people that have that view, it deteriorates. It deteriorates into criminal acts, and it deteriorates into hate crime, because their views get so entrenched that it becomes violent, it becomes extremist. And hate is not intellectual. Hate is not an expression. It's a reaction. It's a reaction to fear. And if we don't understand something, if we think something is different and strange, we can easily turn violent. And there is this concept called the pyramid of hate, which is an absurd concept, really. But this is what it says. It basically says at the base of the pyramid, you have prejudice attitudes. So you don't challenge sexist behaviour, you don't challenge racist behaviour, you just let it slide. Those attitudes can really easily become embedded, and now they're actions. So now you're the one making the joke. That escalates, it becomes more and more entrenched. You're in a position of authority. Now you can use your influence to discriminate, because you think, oh, these people are worthy, these people are not. So this is where I'm going to put my attention. This is where the people I'm going to help and support, these other people are inconsequential. That becomes more and more entrenched, and it leads to violence. Now things don't just irritate you, they enrage you. Something's got to be done about it. It can very easily trigger violence. And then if you take it to its extreme, you've got genocide, haven't you? Which is ridiculous, isn't it? So what are you telling us then? You're telling us that not not challenging a racist joke at one level leads to the extermination of an entire people at the other. That seems absurd, but it's not difficult to see how these things escalate, how they become entrenched, how people become closer and closer knit and tighter instead of being more open and more understanding, more accepting. Hate crime has a huge impact on people's mental health, on people's sense of well-being, increase in people taking their own lives. It has a huge impact. When these things seep into our institutions, our educational establishments, our politics, our health system, when they seep into these establishments, they become institutionalized. And that's when it becomes so difficult to unravel them. When it becomes structural, when it becomes systemic, it will just take a long time to unpick and unravel. And in many cases, things are connected. There are connections. In the work that we do, it's called intersectionality. It's an interesting concept, and there is a lot more follow-up material. We're just going to touch on it very briefly. But it basically talks about how everything is connected. You can face discrimination in the world as a woman. You can also face discrimination if you're black. So if you're a black woman, you face a particular type of discrimination. You can face discrimination if you have a disability. You can also face discrimination if you're gay. So if you're a gay person with a disability, you face a particular type of discrimination. There's an overlap, there's a convergence, and that convergence is called intersectionality. It's really a way of understanding complexity in the world and understanding that, things are connected, there is an overlap. There's a lot of really good material on it. Just really, very, very quickly, just touch the surface there. To recap, like Pam said right at the beginning on that quote, the path to cultural competency is a lifelong journey. Whether we realise it or not, we are all of us on it. And here is a little graph. In this instance, it's becoming an anti-racist, but it doesn't have to be. It could be about sexuality, it could be about gender, it could be anything, it could be about homophobia. But it represents different zones. Some people are very fortunate. They're in the growth zone. They're well advanced on their journey. Some of us are just beginning the journey. But for many people, we're somewhere in the middle. Wherever you are on the journey, I would consider becoming an ally. It's what I've tried to do with my life. I mean, I'm nobody famous. I don't have a huge social media following, but I have choices. I have a degree of dignity, hopefully. Basically, an ally is just somebody who picks up the strain. Somebody who extends their choices, extends their voice to people who have less voice, have less choice. Just somebody who picks up the strain. There's a number of ways to look at becoming an ally and to look at privilege generally. There's what I consider to be the comfortable way of looking at privilege. I try to acknowledge my privilege. But it's basically sort of saying, listen. Privilege doesn't mean that you've been born rich, that you've had an easy life, that you haven't had any challenges in your life. You haven't had to struggle, you haven't had to work hard to get where you've got to. Okay? I mean, it's fine, because if you start to talk to me about privilege, that's what I will tell you. And if you dare to put the word white in front of privilege, I'll be very quick to tell you how my wife is black and how I came from East London and I lived in a terraced house with an outside toilet and how long have you got? So it's basically just saying to people, look, it just means that there are things going on in the world that you just don't have to worry about just because of who you are. So like I say, my house is not on fire. No one's got a spray can out and spray and go home on my wall. My house is not on fire. Microaggressions, right over my head. Couldn't even begin to tell you. Last time I was on the receiving end of a microaggression. When I leave here, if I go to Sainsbury's, no one's going to be following me around the supermarket. Yeah, if I go to that shop where those girls went in London, they're going to be falling over themselves to make sure I'm comfortable and sell me stuff. So my house is not on fire. So just think there are things going on in the world that you just don't have to worry about, just based on where you are in the world. But there is an uncomfortable way of looking at privilege, which many people don't like to look at. Many people who are older white people don't like being told this. But I think that it behoves everybody to at least ask the question and make the inquiry. If you seek out a book by Peggy McIntosh called White Privilege, she talks about, and she uses herself as an example, she talks about an uncomfortable way of looking at privilege. And she describes privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that she can count on cashing in every day. She talks about an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, food, and blank checks that she can use anytime she wants, just because of who she is. Does it make her a bad person? Of course not. But it's understanding where you fit in the world. Action has to come from those who have the power. It has to come from those who have the power. People can demonstrate, people can work, and people work till their backs are breaking. And if they're very lucky and the tide is with them, they will make small improvements to everybody's lives. Everybody's lives. People in power could do it in a heartbeat. Could do it in a heartbeat if they choose to. But what can you do? Be a role model. You can do no more than that, can you? Be a role model. What does Gandhi say? Be the change you want to see in the world. Be a reflective practitioner. Do training like this. Do more training like this. Keep asking yourself, why? Be professionally curious. Whatever role you have within this organisation, whatever voice you have, use it. Use it to make the organisation more successfully diverse, more representative, more relevant to 2022 rather than 1942. Diversity is all about creating a culture where everybody can thrive. Everybody feels welcome. Everybody feels they have a sense of belonging and they're listened to. They have a voice. There's lots of tips there. I'm not going to go through all those tips. You'll get all the slides. There are lots of really positive things that you can take forward from this training. But it's difficult. It's difficult. I concede that it's not easy. Conversations around pronouns are uncomfortable. Conversations around different sexuality is uncomfortable. Conversations around race, LGBTQ, all these things are difficult. It's called unconscious bias for a reason. Don't beat yourself up about it, but explore it. Explore it, find out more about it. This is the last slide in the presentation. You'll be pleased to know, I'm sure. Let me leave you with these two thoughts. The slide on the right, very appropriate, I think, given that we're in a learning institution. Educating the mind, Aristotle said, without educating the heart is no education at all. It's all well and good booking up for this training and ticking the boxes and taking it all in here. I would argue it needs to be in here. It needs to be in your heart, needs to be in your core. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. And lastly, empathy. Empathy, yeah? Whether you look at it from walking a mile in someone's shoes, whether you look at it from cultivating a circuit breaker that gives you pause before you judge, before you make an assumption, or at the very least, before you act on your assumption, a circuit breaker, empathy is key. The more we understand ourselves, the more we know about other people. And the more we know about other people, the better we can understand ourselves. And that concludes today's EDI training. Thank you so much for your patience.